Welcome back, or welcome to the Tiny Shifts podcast. I'm your host, Andy Nunn, and this is episode number 5. So, if you haven't listened to this already, this is a podcast about how the mind actually works, not how we wish it worked. It's about the small, often invisible thinking habits that quietly shape some of our choices, our conversations, and the way we sort of react under pressure. Each episode, I take one idea from psychology, from world news, philosophy, and turn it into something practical. So, my goal here isn't to sort of create any hype, but just hopefully give you tools that you can try each week. And some of these ideas are probably going to feel quite comfortable. And I think that's precisely the point. It's those that actually matter. It's like stepping outside of your comfort zone is where you're going to achieve something in life. And today's episode is very topical. It's about fear and it's about headlines. And it's about why throwing facts into emotional conversations that you might be having at the moment with friends or family members about things, world events that are going on, almost never works. So we're going to look at a few things. So what happens actually in the brain when something feels threatening? Or even if it's not, if it feels threatening, what happens? Why rare dangers suddenly feel everywhere and how we can't really understand risk with that, and how a few mental shortcuts quietly hijack our sense of risk and why this happens. Then my goal is to give you a simple tool that you can use when you're having conversations about what's happening, and a way to sort of slow things down before they spiral and they escalate with people that you care about. So I think we've all had it, we've had ever tried to calm someone down with statistics and watch them double down. This week with obviously, you can't ignore what's going on in the US, but putting that aside, the shark situation and shark culling and the news, and I've been keeping a sort of eye on what's been going on there. And this is the reason why I decided to do this podcast this week is I've been reading some of the threads and conversations people have, and I just see the back and forth, and I try and understand why can people not see the statistics? Why do the statistics don't matter? And it's hard. It's really hard when you see like 4 attacks in 48 hours. A young boy died, and it's tragic. And I think when you see the conversations that are happening, people are just really angry and really upset, and they have a right to be. From my point of view, before we go into this, I've dived with sharks. I used to be terrified of them when I first came to Australia. I wouldn't even go in the sea. I was scared of Bondi, and I had every time I'd go into the water, I'd be petrified a shark was going to kill me. I remember as a kid being in the swimming pool and having those irrational fears that a shark was chasing me. Over the years, I've become to sort of love sharks in a way and really appreciate them. And on my honeymoon, I went and dived with tiger sharks, bull sharks, salmon sharks, reef sharks. The only ones that I haven't really dived with are hammerheads and great whites. Everything else I've pretty much seen. Well, obviously there's so many different species, but I mean like a lot of the common ones that you would know. And from my experience, in under the water, you can feel their power, you can feel their presence, and you understand that they are an apex predator. And it is something that you do have to be scared of, but I think there's certain ways that we can go about this and having this conversation, because I don't think everyone understands it's a very complex topic. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these issues is they are very complex and they're very emotional. And when you combine them two together, it's very hard. People's opinions are very polarized. Anyway, we'll go on to this because I realize how difficult these conversations are. And you might have had or heard or seen some of these topics. And hopefully by the end of this, you're going to be able to work through this. And here's a quick favor before we dive in, actually. This show is only going to grow from people who share it or click like. So if something does land today, please send it to someone. Please leave a review, leave a comment. Just let me know, what you want to hear about, and I'll do my best to sort of go over those sort of topics. I've got so many exciting topics I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about like perspective, social contagion, which is such an exciting topic. I'm going to the expectation effect and placebo. That's going to be coming over the next few weeks. And then I'll be doing a sort of deep dive on some hypnosis topics. Quite exciting stuff I've got planned out for the year. And this is a really busy period for me. So if I can get through this period, still delivering a podcast each week, I think I can get through any. And I've just hired my first assistant who's going to help me. So that's going to be able to help me really deliver and put more work into sort of these podcasts. So I don't just have to last minute put something together because I said I was going to. So let's get into it. So remember, one line I want to give to you all is this episode is going to help you stay rational. As rational as you can be anyway, when emotions run high. And the way it's going to work, I want you to go away sort of understanding how fear warps the risk that you have or the other person you're talking to. And I want to use a simple way to reopen real conversation about these topics without getting them heated. And again, like I say, these are very polarizing conversations. So I know how hard they can actually be. Okay. So let me start with something most of us have done. You're in a conversation with someone about something emotional. So let's just say what's been on the news recently, like shark tank attacks. But it could be, think of COVID, there was vaccines, crime rates was another one, safety, government control, things like this. There's a lot of different topics that are quite polarizing. And someone in the conversation gets worked up and you can see they obviously care a lot about it. So you do what sort of feels logical to you in that moment. And you bring out sort of statistics, sort of numbers. So for the sharks, you'd be like, yeah, but sharks kill, 10 people a year. 10 people is globally is 10 people less on average over the years. And then you can be like, well, the number of deaths in Australia is about 3 or 4 a year. You might get 20 attacks. And statistically, you're more likely to die on the way to the beach. We kill 100 million sharks a year get killed, and 10 on average people get killed. That's the statistics, and that's the real numbers that we know. Now that you would bring that up, and you'd think that would work, wouldn't you? You would be like, that's exactly what it is. And somehow the conversation just gets a lot worse. People say, well, you value a shark's life over it. We cull dingoes. We cull other things. Why can't we cull apex predators? My children are going in the sea. We should be able to go and surf and feel safe. And a lot of these, you have to sort of agree with. And it's hard to, get past those because if people have those beliefs, it's really, really difficult. So they dig in even more and they'll start saying their bull sharks are breeding uncontrollably. They're everywhere. They're going in our rivers. They're going up our streams. Kids can't go in the water. And when you have kids and safety and especially sharks, the idea of a shark attack hits so many of those things that we're scared of. It can be really, really difficult. So you get frustrated. You're like, yeah, but it's 3 people a year. Look at the odds. It's very, very low. You think of the estimated number of people that go in the water in Australia each year is about 50 million. 50 million people, or 50 million, not people, times people go in the water. And you might only get less than 3 people who die a year, 50 million times. But that doesn't change their mind. That's not going to change their mind. They're going to get emotional, ignorant. You're going to be like, they're stubborn. They're not listening. How stupid are they? But we need to realize underneath all of this, there is something else. It's their brain. It's a natural thing. The threat systems in the brain, the emotional reasoning that we all have, the cognitive biases. And humans have evolved this way of judging rare risks as big numbers. It's just the way we work. We detect threats in this manner and we sort of get blinded by it. So by the end of this episode, my goal is for you to know that why fear shuts down this part of our brain, the statistical thinking, which shortcuts drive overreaction, and how to reopen the conversation before lead into like facts about all of this, because if you just start with those numbers, it just kills the conversation. Okay, that's essentially what happens. So here's the core idea that I want to give to you. Okay, strong emotions don't just color our opinions, they change how we process information. And learning to slow that shift is the key to better conversations about risk. And we have a responsibility as individuals to learn these tools and to be able to have these conversations without it escalating into something serious. Because there's a lot of topics here that are quite inflammatory. So here's the belief I want to sort of challenge with you today. If people just knew the numbers, they would calm down. That's what you think, that you ever believe. They just need to know the statistics. What's actually happened? The brain treats threats very differently to neutral emotion. Gets the first say, essentially, and logic sort of comes later. And the shift we're building towards is stop leading with data, stop thinking that facts are going to win this argument. So you want to slow the threat response first and then invite thinking back online. You want to build a bridge between you and the conversation. And we're going to go over that at the end. I'm going to give you a tool that's going to help you with this. So before we get into sharks or vaccines or any threat of that kind or wars, we need to slow down and talk about what a bias actually is. Why does our brain do this? Why would we evolve like this? So what does the science say about biases? It says the first thing, psychologists don't treat biases as bugs. Everyone says it's a bug. It's actually a feature, okay? That's the key. A bias is a feature. It's a mental shortcut that evolved because the world was dangerous, it was fast, it was uncertain. We had to make quick decisions. You don't have time to sit down and calculate possibilities. There's a line in the bush, you had to get out immediately. And it's the same with threats in other situations, meeting people and stuff like this. So if something looked threatening, hesitation could be fatal. So you just had to respond immediately. Now, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, about this sort of idea of system 1 and system 2 thinking. He would say a bias is like system 1, it's this automatic in the moment straight away. System 2 is the more sit down and, being analyzing, being more analytical. For an example, what's 2 plus 2? You're going to go 4 immediately. That's system 1. You don't have to think about it. It's a small cognitive load. 72 times 16. Your brain's just going to feel that cognitive load just there. So those shortcuts help people survive. The trouble is we're still living in with Stone Age software inside of our heads, funny enough, in a world of statistics, social media, 24-hour news. Our brains weren't evolved to handle all of this chaos that we're living in right now. So a bias is just a brain trading accuracy for speed, basically. And most of the time that's useful, okay? Like we're running on autopilot most of the time, but it can distort reality. So let's quickly highlight why they evolved. From an evolutionary point of view, it made sense to over-detect threats rather than under-detect them. If you want to survive, you didn't want to be like, okay, well, maybe it's okay. To trust your group, your tribe. You're often very trustworthy with them. Pay attention to like vivid stories that you have. Okay? So storytelling is really important, the way we see it, and the stories that we build up inside of our mind, these narratives, and really simplify complex systems into very quick narratives. It makes sense for something to be like good or bad. Idea of shark threats is such a triggering emotional response. It's very easy to be like, okay, well, we need to simplify this narrative. We just need to cull them and get rid of them. It's very easy for us to get into that. Or vaccines, to be like, it can be, you don't know what the value is around vaccines. It could be control, it could be safety, it could be freedom. It could be one of the values is being sort of challenged whenever people don't like vaccines, but you have to sort of work out what that value is. So let's go back to where I was. Just think about for a second, if you heard a rustle in the bushes and assumed danger, you might run unnecessarily, basically, even though it's not like a snake or something like this. In Australia, the snakes, I was on a run this morning and, you hear a rustle and you just have to ignore it in the end when you do so much running. But if you ignored it and were wrong, you don't get a second chance. Lucky enough, I'm just running along, so I just keep running. But it could be a snake. It could be a lizard. It's going to be one of those two, basically. But natural selection favors brains that erred on the side of caution. So over time, they basically got rid of the people who went, oh, maybe it's not a snake. Let me have a look. Dead. Okay. No, the people who run away were the people who survived. Natural selection got these people, they evolved to be more cautious. And that because that kept you alive. So it made sense. Fear spreads faster than nuance for a reason, basically. So what biases actually do to thinking? I think this is an important thing to sort of work out when we go over this. When a bias kicks in, three things usually happen. Number one, attention narrows. Attention narrows. So imagine all this information was coming in everywhere around you. You basically go into the smallest piece of information. You only just focus on certain pieces of it and you ignore the rest. So think about the shark situation. You ignore the real bigger picture and you just focus on the fact that a kid died, which is obviously awful. And then memory reshapes itself. So dramatic cases stick. You start remembering all the other shark attacks, that happened in Botany, like the guy who was swimming, he died. And the data, you just ignore it really. So the reasoning behind it sort of becomes directional. You don't ask what's true. You ask, how do I defend the position I'm drifting towards? And then this is when biases come into play, like confirmation bias and stuff like this. And none of this is irrational. Remember, when it's happening, it feels like you're being sensible. Okay, that's the important thing, is the person who's going through this process feels like they're being rational and sensible about it. So how many biases do we think there are? Well, researchers have catalogued over 100 basically, but they often blend and they go over each other. They overlap a lot of the time. So if you think about it, at the core, small set keeps showing up basically. I said to a lot of them. So they're like threat detection, pattern seeking, social belonging, loss avoidance, energy saving, and story building. They're the biases that sort of the core categories that we sort of have. And we have different labels, but they're the same machinery, basically, confirmation bias and things like this, loss aversion, optimism bias, negativity bias, status quo, all these sort of things. They're all expressions of the same idea. The brain is trying to decide fast, obviously reduce cognitive load. It's not looking for accuracy. That's the important thing. So here's a key point to just clarify. Biases don't mean people are stupid. Okay. Everyone has them. They mean they're human. Okay. You have them. I have them. Everyone listening to this podcast has them. The real skill isn't eliminating biases. It's impossible. Everyone asks me, how do we do this? It's learning to notice when one has taken the wheel and when thinking is slowed down, when you're not really being rational, critical thinking. That's when you can change the conversation, you can change the narrative, you can change the story that you're telling yourself. And that's when the statistics finally gets a chance to land. So let's walk through the main ones that show up in fear-heavy topics. These are some important ones. So number one, which I think right now for shark attacks, is the availability bias. So this is the one that makes recent or dramatic events feel very common. So if shark attacks dominate the news for a week, which they are, especially 4 in 48 hours, which is crazy, your brain quietly upgrades the risk to really, really high. Not because the numbers change, but because the story is easy to recall. Your memory becomes a stand-in for reality. So basically you'll start seeing sharks everywhere. You start noticing it. You see it more on the news. It seems like a much bigger problem. People start getting drones out, spotting more sharks in the water, and it just makes it compounds and gets bigger and bigger. So this availability bias is a really big problem at the moment. Then we've got heuristics, which again are little short programming stories that you tell yourself. So the affect heuristic, this is a fancy way of saying feelings become evidence. So again, it's another shortcut. So feelings become evidence. So if something scares you, it's probably the best example. It feels risky. Yeah. If it feels wrong, it must be dangerous, if that makes sense. So the brain doesn't step in and be like, okay, wait a minute, and ask how often actually does this happen? It just says, how bad would it be if it did happen? So when you're in the water, you're not going, oh, like, how often do people get eaten by sharks? It'd be like, how terrible would this situation be if I went in the water and there was a shark attack? The next thing is confirmation bias, which is the most common one people have. Everyone's Googling, how many shark attacks. They're Googling information. They're watching YouTube videos. They're all doing all this stuff. Because once you lean one way And once you have a narrative, your attention follows that narrative. So the way you type a question into Google will dictate the response that you get. So you're like, I think sharks are dangerous. I think shark culling is the way drumlines work. You'll be like, give me 5 reasons why drumlines work, or tell me how many shark attacks there's been. And you'll start looking at all these shark attacks and put them together. And it's confirming your beliefs that, they're terrible. The same with vaccines. So for instance, during COVID, I was going through this problem when, we were taking the vaccines. I was starting Googling like heart problems, going in the news and trying to see if there was the stuff of myocarditis and all this sort of stuff. And I was trying to get confirmation in my beliefs that they weren't safe, And I had to really take a step back and look at the bigger picture and really understand, wait a minute, you know, this is a situation, obviously individual cases are rare. That doesn't mean they're unsafe. And it's the same with shark attacks. Yes, these are rare. It doesn't mean getting in the water is dangerous. Okay. There is a threat. And it's hard sometimes when you're emotionally involved. I was the same when I was thinking about vaccines. So you skim past the evidence that doesn't match your current belief. It's selective. You're just looking for things that confirm your existing beliefs. And we do this. Next one is the illusion of explanatory depth. And this one is subtle. We think we understand a lot of complex systems. So we can all do this. How many people became experts at sort of vaccines after COVID, or, politics, or how to stop the spread of disease? There's all these people that became immunology experts, and it's pretty hilarious, really, to be honest. So think about the shark situation, shark ecology. People know the gestation period of bull sharks. They know how much they breed. They know all this information about them, which can't be true. They know how many sharks there are in the water. They know where they're going, where they're breeding. They know the dangers and the increase. Without the research, there's no, people like, oh, I've got the research to back it up. And the research is their mate Dave up in Queensland who's doing some fishing. It's crazy. And then vaccine development, exactly the same. Everyone's like, but spike proteins, this or that. And the truth is, we can look at certain information and we can be like, oh, a doctor said this. There were some people that came out, like Brett Weinstein. He's come out. He's been on Joe Rogan. Does that mean one person is somehow going against all the other scientific research? It's quite interesting. But if you feel that the vaccines are unsafe, you will see that as evidence. You'll see that as proof. You will ignore the fact of all the studies and all the research that goes along it. And it's just an unnatural way to do it. So we'll talk about in a sec of how to undo those. The next one is government policy. We'll think of that. Anyway, we carry a rough story in our head and mistake it for deep understanding. So confidence sort of fills that gap. The next one's motivated reasoning. This is when the belief becomes tied to identity. So if your group thing says something like disagreeing can feel like betrayal, so the brain starts working backwards. It's not like what's true about this. This is how do I defend my sort of belief, my system. So if you belong and you think you're fighting for freedom and for this voice and security and independence and stuff like this, and safety, whatever these values are that you have, and you belong to that group of people, or it could be your side of politics, you'll start trying to defend them without thinking of the actual statistics. Then we have scope intensity. This one explains why a single death can outweigh thousands. This is the Stalin sort of idea, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Our brains really, really struggle. And there's some unbelievable research. I was going to put it in, but there's been some incredible studies that have done about this. Why does one person feel so tragic? And that's with a shark death, even though it's like 4, this one individual was in the water doing the thing they loved, and it just feels so tragic. And it's really bad. But we forget the hundreds of people, the thousands that die every day or every year in drowning incidents. We just don't hear about them as much, and they don't connect. So we might hear them and just forget, but shark attack stays in our memory. So remember, all these biases exist for a reason. They helped us survive. But in modern debates, they can quietly distort our sense of risk, inflate rare dangers, and make conversations feel impossible. It can make it really hard to navigate the internet, to find information that's true or false. A lot of fake news out there. We use YouTube as a source of information because we don't trust the bigger newspapers and stuff like this. And this lack of trust Once you see it and you see that there has been mistakes made in the past, you can see that as validation, as confirmation bias in your feelings. And it just makes it worse, and you become more polarized, and it's really difficult to get back into the middle to really sort of understand where you came from. So the key thing is the person across from you in this situation who believes in something that you don't believe, they're not broken. Okay. Their brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Okay. So once you see that, the whole conversation can sort of change. You can realize that you can show a bit more empathy towards it, a bit of understanding. Just because they don't agree with whatever you agree with or what your belief is, doesn't mean that they're wrong. I think that's the important thing. So let's run these through. I think I went through it actually with the shark attack, but not to judge anyone, but we'll go through it really quickly. When the headlines say 4 attacks, so the availability bias first, those stories become easy to recall. Okay, I think I've already said that. The graphic, emotional, they get repeated over the news, constant news cycle. Then we have things like the affect heuristic. Sharks are terrifying in a very specific way. They're unseen, they're powerful, they live in the water. So where we feel vulnerable, we can't see under the depth of the water. So the emotional reaction to it all is very strong. And it feels horrifying. So it must be risky, right? And that's not logic. That's your nervous system talking here. It's the emotional side. Confirmation bias. When people start saying this is getting out of control, you start looking for stuff that was sort of noticed. And when you see the reports and more incidents and more shark sightings, more Instagram videos, your Instagram feed starts showing sharks over and over again, you'll start thinking that shark populations they're going to be coming on land soon to get us. So, and then there's the illusion of explanatory depth. So as I've mentioned before, there's a lot of people right now talking about migration patterns, breeding cycles, gestation periods, ocean temperatures, all this sort of stuff, conservation policy, and the fishery. And there's so many different factors that come into play here. And the truth is there's no expert in all of those. And we're listening to people who aren't experts at all. So we've only been given fragments of this, and somehow our brain can come in and be like, actually, I know what I'm talking about. I admit myself, I don't know enough to have a valid argument against someone. I don't know if the bull shark populations are increasing massively and it's going to cause problems, or the fact we've messed all the ecosystem up, the fact that we have overfished our oceans, that maybe the bull sharks are coming in and because they're running out of food. The report that I read that bull sharks are getting smaller. So over the last 20 years, the research is that bull sharks on average, the ones that are caught, were decreasing by about 1 centimeter each year. And they think that it's because they're more juvenile sharks, they're not maturing enough. So maybe they are breeding more, but they're not living as longer because there isn't enough food, there isn't enough opportunity for them to sort of mature, and they're getting caught before that happens. But I don't know that. I just know from the research, and I can just build a narrative that makes sense to me. So this next part, I want to go over what happens when the conversation gets heated, when you're in a polarizing conversation with a friend or family member, and you can't seem to sort of understand where they're coming from. I use this acronym CALM, and it stands for this. So C for control yourself. Like, you can't have a rational conversation. You can't have a reasonable conversation with somebody if you're getting angry and heated and emotional. And it's really hard. I find this part the most difficult, especially when it's a topic I care about. I'm very interested in sharks, or, things like this, or it can be anything really. And when you hear someone who doesn't agree with it and you don't know where they're getting their information from, it's so easy to be like, why are they being so stupid? But you need to just take a step back and realize that this is how their mind works. This is how they're sort of experiencing it. So really slow your breathing, lower your voice. It's not about patronizing them. It's just about speak a little bit slower. Okay. Relax your face, relax your jaw is a good one. You can move it around. And because if you don't regulate first before you go into this, and it comes in as a battle, nothing else is going to work. You're never going to be able to sort of change their minds. So the tiny thing to remember, calm your body before you calm the room. I think that's the important thing. Okay. The next part is acknowledge the feeling. Acknowledge the feeling. So A for calm. So C, and then A is acknowledge the feeling. So name what you hear without agreeing with whatever they're talking about, if that makes sense, the claim that they're trying to say. So if they're like, sharks are really dangerous, they are breeding uncontrollably. We need to cull them. We need to kill them. We need to get rid of them all. And so just rather than saying agreeing with what they're claiming, okay, name what you hear, what the feeling that you're seeing, okay, acknowledge what they feel, the feeling they have. So in this situation, I could probably say, I can see why that would be terrifying. It'd be scary. I get why you'd be angry about that. So imagine the vaccine situation. Like vaccines are causing cancer or people heart problems or stuff like this. Rather than just disagreeing with it, just say, I can see why that would be worrying. That would be scary if you, I can see that. And it sounds terrifying, if that's the case. So you're not saying they're right. You're agreeing with how they feel. That's the important factor, okay? And it also just bridges that gap between you. It shows that you're listening, okay? Shows that you're listening. Then the L is the next part, is learn what's underneath. So what value is being triggered here with them? Think about, for instance, the shark situation. So ask questions here to uncover the values and reasoning behind it. So these are some questions that you can ask. So you've acknowledged, I can see why that would be scary for you. So ask, what worries you about this? Or what are you trying to protect? How did you come to that view? So then reflect it back to them. So if it's about sharks, you'll be like, so it's more about safety, being safe in the ocean, or it's more about, the people not dying or stuff like this than the sharks themselves. You want to protect life. Is that what you want? Yes. Okay, I can see why that would make sense. Or if it's vaccines, if they're like, well, a lot of people think, vaccines are a form of control, or big pharma is just trying to make money and stuff like this. And try and understand, why does that worry you? What is it about this that sort of frustrates you? And trying to understand where that's coming from. So it's more about this than that. It's not about the vaccines themselves. And it can't be just about that. Maybe they think the vaccines are a threat to the body. We have a freedom to be able to make a choice, to make a decision. I shouldn't have to get vaccinated. All these sort of things. So it's a freedom. It's freedom that sort of worries you. And whatever that is, then you can sort of understand then. So you can understand what value and where they're getting their reasoning. So that the curiosity lowers their defense and makes them realize, yeah, it does. And it'll just make them go, yeah, freedom is the thing that sort of worries me. Then the next part is is the M. So it's the final part, is you want to make space for them to have doubt. If you want them to understand, it's not about giving them facts. It's not about being like, okay, well, realistically, do you know it's more likely to die on the way to the beach than going in the water? That's not going to do anything, okay? So don't attack whatever their conclusion is. So you need to just invite uncertainty. So the scale system is really good for this. So how sure are you from 0 to 10 of this is certain? So imagine vaccines. So the COVID vaccine causes heart problems. How certain are you from a scale of 0 to 10 that this is a problem? And then ask then, okay, what would do to move 1 point downwards? Could there be another explanation to this? Could there be a different perspective that you're not understanding? And it offers alternatives really gently. How sure are you from 0 to 10? What would do to move 1 point? Could there be another explanation? And that should sort of help. It's not about, forcing statistics on them. It's about opening the door and gently opening the door and getting them to sort of understand, is there any fact that would sort of change your view? Is there anything, piece of information that would change your view? And often there wouldn't be, that's the problem. But we just need to lower it. And it's about meeting them in the middle and building that bridge. So just to recap, fear doesn't change what people believe. It changes how their brain processes information. Okay, so that's the important thing. People make mistakes all the time. What we do, and we go into these arguments, we lead with stats, why the threat is really high, why people are really emotional. We assume the other person is irrational. That's when we go into this, they're irrational, they don't understand, they're just getting all their information from this. It's not how we're going to meet in the middle and have these conversations. You go into these arguments trying to win instead of trying to slow the system, trying to relax into it, if that makes sense. So here's 3 things that you can go with today, just to remember, okay? You need to regulate yourself first. regulate yourself first. Make sure you're calm when you have these conversations. Validate their emotion without agreeing with them. Just say, I can see why that would worry. I can see why that's frustrating. I can see why, those stats might be alarming. I can see that sounds scary. And just invite thinking back gently. Use that calm method, okay? And hopefully with all of this, you'll be able to approach these conversations. So, weekly experiment. This week, when a conversation gets heated, pause and control your body before speaking. Try and relax. Reset your nervous system. Try and breathe, anchor on it. And remember to acknowledge how they feel and sort of learn about where their worries come from, what values, what's their emotional reasoning. Okay, go through that questioning system. And finally, just try your best to sort of make them gently see a different perspective. Okay, and the only way you're going to do that is not by forcing facts on them. Okay, just bringing this scale from a 0 to 10, how certain are you of this, and bringing them down. Okay, and through this we can have better conversations, we can be a bit more clear, we can hopefully be able to resolve this and understand each other a lot better rather than being so polarized right now. And it's really difficult with everything that's going on in the world to sort of detach our emotions from it. And this is a skill that I know I've been terrible at over the years. And this is why I like talking about it and learning about it. Because if I can do it as being an emotionally reactive person and trying to throw my opinion around, hopefully other people can as well. So remember, this episode helps people catch that fear-driven thinking. And I would love you to just share it, like it, comment. And yeah, I look forward to chatting to you all soon. Thank you.